Please join me in welcoming Rafae from Mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 p.m., and I know I'm standing between you and the closing. So trust me, I feel you. Thanks for staying. It's actually my wedding anniversary today, and for those of you who are married, you would know that I cannot afford to be late for dinner today, right? So yeah, let's try and get all of you out of here as well as myself on time. So I'm Rafae Bhatti. I am the Director of Security and Compliance at Mode. I build security programs at startups. So currently at Mode, prior to that, at a healthcare company called HealthTap, and before that at New Relic, when it was pre-IPO. More recently, I'm also a licensed attorney in California. Don't hold that against me, though. Because in my new journey, in my career, I view my role more of, not so much as a lawyer, but more of a legal engineer, an engineer that's trained in law and its application. So enough about myself. What is this talk about? Well, this talk is going to be about scenarios that are based on data protection risks. Data protection risks like GDPR, CCPA, we all understand that they create risks, but why should security teams care? So let's talk about the problem that we are trying to solve, and then we'll go from there. Any Jason Bourne fans in the audience? Yeah. This is an original motion picture soundtrack of that movie, and there's a song in it called Backdoor Breach. The movie is about backdoor exploits to gain unauthorized access into computer systems. And the reason I'm choosing to start my talk with this is because the traditional security risk landscape is focused on backdoor breaches. In fact, this scene from the movie is a good analogy. This is a custom-built SWAT truck. It's in a car chase sequence on the Vegas Strip. Why do we build a custom SWAT truck here? It's designed to be not infiltrated. However, for those of you who have seen this car chase, the driver still ended up crashing it due to poor navigation. And if you haven't, you should. It's pretty stunning how this ends. So now imagine you are building an application that is designed to be impenetrable. You do your threat modeling, pen testing, and the like. But much like this SWAT truck, navigating it poorly means that that application can still be compromised by someone who is in the driving seat. So what do we do about that? Well, this is where we want to focus between backdoor breaches and what I'm going to call front door breaches. Let me give you a couple examples. Equifax, backdoor breach. Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, front door breach. Now, I know you would be thinking that the concept of front door breaches is not pretty easy for us to digest as security teams. After all, by information security standards, what happens in a front door breach is technically not a breach. So in this case, no systems were compromised, no sensitive information was accessed or leaked. However, in this case, what happened is that it's not a matter of their systems being infiltrated or compromised, but it's their systems working as designed and allowing the data to be misused. So the next logical question is, why should security teams care? So let's look at the legal consequences. Equifax, about 170 million accounts compromised. The penalties were $700 million and up. That was the settlement amount. In case of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, half of that amount was about half as many users were affected, so about 87 million user profiles for whom their data was accessed, for political campaigns. But at that time, GDPR was not in effect, and so the fine was capped at £500,000. If that type of incident were to happen today, given Facebook's current market cap, the fine would have been upwards of £1.4 billion. So security teams can no longer ignore front door breaches, or you might want to call them legal breaches. But what we can do is measure the data protection risk. To be able to do that, we need to view the risks from both technical and legal lens. What you see in this picture is a scientific phenomenon called Parallax. It's the apparent displacement of an object based on the change in the observer's point of view. Astronomers use this technique to measure distance to the stars. So in our world, parallax occurs when the legal and security teams view the risks to an organization from different perspectives. Security teams might consider this is not a breach because no systems were infiltrated. Legal teams would say it's a violation of our legal obligations, so this is a data breach. So to address this dilemma, engineers and lawyers need to do something they don't usually do. They need to talk. Who would know what happened when an engineer and a lawyer walked into a bar? Usually nothing, because they never did. Except in this case, the engineer and lawyer is one person, and he's talking to you right now. So the sentence ends with, he ordered a drink. So when I walk into the bar with myself, what do I see? I'm able to see security from data protection lens. And in my experience, it distills down to the following. The biggest transition that security teams need to make is to view the risks from data subject perspective. In the world of legal breaches, it's not just about unauthorized access. It is about reasonable expectation. It's at the core of GDPR, CCPA, and almost all data protection laws. So for example, getting clarity on the risks that are introduced throughout the data lifecycle. If you use customer data for other than business purpose, you're going to be liable. It's not just about technical controls, but also contractual obligations, both upstream and downstream. So if your vendor or partner misuses customer data, it's a breach that you are liable for. And it's about implementing reasonable controls, security controls that help reduce the data protection risks. You may want to do risk calibration and trade-offs to prioritize the most important risks based on their legal consequences. So looks like we have a plan, but are we done yet? Not quite. While this is all good, the path to navigating these risks is often filled with uncertainty. So you might ask, okay, what type of data can I collect or process or store? What type of controls are adequate or reasonable for me? And what type of obligations should we accept or enforce? How do we find clarity amidst this uncertainty? If you ask a lawyer, their response, 2 words most commonly used by lawyers, any guesses? There you go. It depends. I mean, the question then is, what would it take for us to go from it depends to, hey, what does it depend on? And that's what we're going to focus on next. So next, we're going to find solution to this problem. When do we find solution? When engineers and lawyers talk. So let's take a look at an example from real life. Suppose you're driving a car. When do you buckle your seatbelt? Always, right? That doesn't depend on anything. When do you turn on your headlights? When the visibility is low. And when can you drive if drunk? Technically below the legal limit, but I'm not endorsing that. So what does this tell us? There's a correlation, there's a risk between driving without headlights or under the influence, and that risk depends on both technical and legal aspects. For example, the risk of driving without headlights depends on the level of ambient light at which visibility is low. That's the technical perspective. But it also depends on the legal interpretation of when the visibility is considered low. So this Mississippi State statute says it includes fog, rain, dawn, dusk, etc., the 3 magic letters. So how close to dusk or dawn? How dense of a fog? You could choose to drive with headlights turned on all the time, and that's overestimating the risk. Or you could choose to drive with headlights turned off until very close to sunset, and that's underestimating the risk. Now suppose turning the headlights on or off is the same as turning the encryption on or off on your data. So keeping the data always encrypted is overestimating the risk, and never encrypting the data even in storage is underestimating the risk. So with this simple example, it at least illustrates the idea of what I'm calling right-sizing your risk profile. So now we have a plan, And we talked about paying attention to data protection risks. We talked about the uncertainty in navigating them and right-sizing the risk profile. And we talked about going from it depends to what does it depend on. The best way to understand what this looks like in practice is by using example scenarios. So let's run with it. Scenario 1 is a company's vendor launches an email campaign using the personal data of the company's users. The data belongs to consumers in California. Can a California consumer sue the company for a CCPA violation? So it's a standard security practice to evaluate vendors, especially when they're processing personal data. So you'd wonder, how can a vendor that passed your security evaluations become a source of legal consequences for the company? To answer that question, we need to understand how the concept of data sharing under CCPA is defined, in particular the concept of sale. So data shared with a vendor can be considered a sale if it's used for any purpose other than providing the service. And for all data considered as sale, the consumer has the right to opt out that you must honor. Let's look at an example. Say you have two tools. One is a UI tool vendor that helps pinpoint bugs in your UI. The other is your customer support portal or ticketing system. Which one of them you think accesses personal data? You may think the UI tool vendor does not, but it may still be accessing personal data in the way it's integrated with your system. So it should be audited for data use. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time anyone here ran a cookie audit on your vendors? So very rarely, right? Vendor security checklists should include a cookie scan, but very few actually do. And you would need that to prevent front door breaches. As for the customer support vendor that has personal data, it must still continue to be held accountable. If it starts to use personal data for purposes other than customer support, such as sending email campaigns for its own business, that would be a CCPA violation and unauthorized sale. And unlike the cookie scan, that type of risk is better addressed using contractual obligations. So the takeaway here is, we need to tie personal data audit to vendor security review. Security teams can help prevent accidental risk accumulation by auditing the risk of the use of personal data through a combination of tools and contractual obligations. And remember, if the use of the personal data by the vendor does not stop for non-business purpose, then the consumer can sue the company. Okay, moving on to the next scenario. A company accidentally shares a report belonging to organization A with organization B. The data belongs to consumers in the EU. Is the company required to notify consumers of a data breach? So data sharing is the classic example of a front door breach. But unlike the vendor scenario, we are in a situation where the breach has already happened. So this ship has sailed. The opportunity to avoid the risk has passed. However, accidental sharing is a really, it's a reality and can happen to anyone. So what can the security team do now? Well, we can prevent a bad situation from getting worse. Let me give you two examples of bad situations. The SWAT truck driver in Jason Bourne navigated the risks poorly and crashed. But in case of Sully, he avoided the crash. Instead, he did a water landing. Let's refresh our memory about Captain Sully of Flight 1549 that landed on the Hudson. Let's see if this goes as expected.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Cactus 1549.
Can anyone hear it?
We've lost thrust on both engines. We are turning back towards the wharf.
No? Okay.
Both engines. Ignition.
Thrust levers confirm idle.
Idle.
Cactus 1549, if we can get it for you, do you want to try to land runway 13?
We are unable. We may end up in the Hudson.
It's going to be left traffic, runway 3.
All right, because you can't see, I'm just going to pause the video right here. Okay, so...
After 30 seconds, Engine Master 1 and 2 confirm off.
Off.
Flight 1549 had a unique risk profile. This is an example of finding clarity in uncertainty. If all Sully had at that time was "it depends," without the clarity of what it depends on, then we can all imagine why it would not have ended so well. But Sully made a decision based on the risk profile of 1549, which was speed was too high,
The flight review movies on American Made and Flight.
altitude was too low,
One of the most frequent comments that were left said, "Do the Sully movie, do the Sully movie." So today, we're doing the Sully movie.
oops, it's not closing. Okay. Okay, so coming back to the breach, typically you also have limited time to decide. How would you decide if you require notification? Once again, it's going to be based on your unique profile. Did the exposed data include personal data? Was the exposed data encrypted, or was the source of breach addressed? The right answer would make a difference between a water landing and a crash. And the answer may even be different based on if you are in California or the EU. In California, if none of this was true, then no notification is required. Under GDPR, you also have to consider if the processing was high risk. So what is high risk processing? Say you have two applications. One is used to share reports with your users about their utility bills, and the other is to share information about clinical tests. And say you have a filter that is used to select the recipients of these reports based on the zip code. And you enter an incorrect zip code, so the reports go to unintended recipients. Ouch, but it happens all the time. In one case, the billing info gets leaked, and in the other case, the clinical tests. Both of them are personal data, but one of them is considered high risk under the law. What do we go back to? Data subject expectations. Processing of billing data is unlikely to be high risk. Why? Because it's used to provide public service. Not so much for clinical tests. The expectation of the patient would be for that data to remain private. So the processing of health data is considered high risk. Therefore, under GDPR, this type of accidental sharing will require notification to the consumers. The takeaway here is focusing on data processing risk helps guide breach mitigation and response. Tying the risk of disclosure back to business consequences should help prioritize security agenda. For example, if you have only one engineer on your team doing security reviews, and you have two projects dealing with personal data, but one of them in public utilities and the other in healthcare, you now know which one to focus on because you know which processing is high risk. But also keep in mind that the analysis is different in California, and both cases will be equal priority. Continuing with breaches, here's our final scenario. Let's assume the previous breach was reportable. You did the right thing and reported the breach. What can possibly go wrong with that? Well, someone can come back and sue you. But not so fast. First of all, this right is not available under GDPR. And under CCPA, this is available when certain conditions are met. So in other words, even if the breach is reportable, it's not always actionable. So here's another opportunity for us as security teams to prevent a bad situation from becoming worse. Let's see how. Let's first find out under what conditions the breach is actionable. Once again, it's going to be based on our unique risk profile. And again, the answers are different based on if it's California or the EU. So the right is not available under GDPR. And in California, under CCPA, even if all of this was true, meaning it was reportable breach, but the company had reasonable security in place, then it's not actionable. So let's break it down. What does it mean to have reasonable security? It means reasonableness of security procedures and practice. It means an operational cybersecurity program. And how do you demonstrate that? Through written documentation and certification. By adherence to an established security standard such as ISO, CSF, NIST CSF, or SOC 2. SOC 2 is the one that most SaaS companies use, and it's the one that's most preferred because it allows you to attest the operational effectiveness of your program. So the takeaway here is that a demonstrably effective and operational cybersecurity program can be your last line of defense. Having an audit report helps demonstrate operational effectiveness, but let's be honest, most of us don't, love compliance work. Oftentimes, we question the value it brings to put the effort in the compliance framework, but realizing that an audit report could be your ally and best friend in case of a breach and help mitigate legal consequences can drive prioritization. Okay, so the title of this talk was Silver Lining for Security Teams. So here's a recap of how viewing security from both data protection lens helps with your security program. The personal data audit to vendor, tying personal data audit to vendor security reviews, focusing on data processing risk, and investing in operational effectiveness of your program. Before I conclude, I would like to add one more thing. If you understand the risks, you will reap the rewards. So communicate the risks to the board, CEO, engineers, everyone. Because when you understand the risks and translate them, you can translate them into business needs. Why is that important? Because needs get buy-in, risks get a workaround. They will ask you to do it another way. You should also harness the power of awareness around data protection to build a security culture. GDPR, CCPA is good guidance that is becoming law. Use the momentum to your advantage. And lastly, more and more security teams are now recognizing how data protection risks are tied to security agenda. Privacy engineering roles are on the rise. I've seen quite a few companies put out recs for them. So take a look at your unique profile and make a business case if you need to hire one. Again, demonstrating the need would help you get the buy-in. So yeah, there you have it. We've all been hit by birds at one point or the other. Hopefully you are taking something away from this talk that would help you avoid crashes and do water landing instead. I'll leave you with this anecdote. After Sully landed flight 1549 on water, he got in touch with the airline operations manager. That person, however, cut Sully off saying, "I can't really talk right now, we have a plane down in the Hudson." To which Sully said, "I know, I'm the guy." So here's hoping when it's our time to land, we are on the Hudson, not in it. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Oh, there is one.
You talked about translating risks into needs. Can you provide a concrete example of what that might look like?
Yeah, so going back to the data processing risk example, I think that was pretty concrete in terms of when you have two different situations requiring security review. Both of them have personal data, but one of them does not have the risk of reporting because the reporting is not high risk, whereas the other has. So the healthcare data has, high data processing risk attached to it. Therefore, you would want to focus more on that in case of like an accidental sharing incident, because that requires notification. But if it's not a high risk processing and you meet all the three criteria that I talked about, which is whether the data contains, whether its exposed data contains personal information, whether it was encrypted, and whether the source of the breach has been cured. If you've met all those three things and the processing is not high risk, then you don't have to worry about it. So going back to when you're coming up with your security priorities, you can look at the source of the data, you can look at the processing risk attached to it, and then you can prioritize where your investments need to be or which needs to get more focused than the other. Another example would be vendor use. So cookie scan can help you detect if the vendor is collecting more data than you are aware of. So that's a risk of misuse of personal data by the vendor that you can translate into a business need by saying that if the vendor does that, we will be liable, therefore we need to invest into additional auditing of vendor data. Any other questions? Otherwise, I can go back to my dinner and you all can go to wherever you need to go. Thank you so much.